The echoing laughter of a wealthy family fills a mahogany boardroom as a grieving widow is handed the deed to a worthless, collapsing cabin. Valued at a pathetic $3, it was meant as a final insult, but underneath the rotting floorboards lay a secret that would destroy them all. The 50th floor conference room of Gallagher and Hayes was a testament to the kind of wealth that did not need to shout. It spoke in hushed tones of polished mahogany, imported Italian leather, and the panoramic, floor-to-ceiling views of the Chicago skyline, currently obscured by a bitter, driving sleet. Inside this fortress of corporate power, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense, heavy with the scent of Brianna Martin, overpowering Chanel perfume, and the stale, expensive cigar smoke that always seemed to cling to her eldest son, Regis. Chelsea. Martin sat at the far end of the sprawling table, acutely aware of the frayed cuffs of her wool coat. She was an island of quiet grief in a sea of predatory anticipation. 2 years had passed since her husband, Arthur, had died in a tragic pile-up on the interstate. But for Chelsea, the wound was as raw as if it had been inflicted yesterday. Arthur had been the anomaly in the Martin family, a man who preferred teaching high school history and hiking in the mountains to hostile takeovers and board meetings. When he had chosen to marry Chelsea, a public school art teacher with a modest background, the family had effectively excised him like a tumor. The only exception had been Thomas Martin, the ruthless patriarch who had built Martin Real Estate Holdings from a single concrete mixer into a multi-billion-dollar empire. Thomas had been a terror in the boardroom, but in the quiet hours of his life, he had harbored a deep, unspoken respect for his youngest son's integrity. After Arthur's death, Thomas had secretly paid for Chelsea's therapy and occasionally summoned her for quiet lunches, offering gruff but genuine comfort. Now, Thomas was gone, felled by a sudden, massive stroke at the age of 72. Charles Gallagher, the family's longtime attorney, cleared his throat, adjusting his silver-rimmed glasses. He was a man entirely devoid of empathy, a highly paid machine designed to execute wills and protect assets. "If we are all settled," Gallagher intoned, his voice dry as dust, "we shall proceed with the final reading of the last will and testament of Thomas Edward Martin." Brianna, draped in a black mink that seemed profoundly unnecessary indoors, leaned forward, her eyes glittering with a ravenous light. Regis smirked, tapping a gold Mont Blanc pen against his leather portfolio. They knew they had won. Thomas had never officially reconciled with Chelsea, and without Arthur to stand in their way, the mother and son duo were ready to carve up the empire. "To my wife, Brianna," Gallagher read, his eyes scanning the thick parchment. "I leave the primary residence in Manhattan, the estate in the Hamptons, and the sum of $50 million in liquid assets, to be disbursed immediately from the primary trust." Brianna didn't even blink. It was exactly what she had demanded in their ironclad prenuptial agreement. Updated only a year prior. "To my eldest son, Regis," the lawyer continued, turning a page, "I leave my entire controlling stake in Martin Real Estate Holdings, comprising 82% of the voting shares, along with the title of Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately upon the reading of this document." Regis let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a decade. He leaned back in his chair, a slow, triumphant grin spreading across his perfectly manicured face. He shot a glance at Chelsea, his eyes cold and mocking. "Heavy lies the crown, Gallagher," Regis drawled, though he looked entirely untroubled by the prospect. Chelsea kept her gaze fixed on the storm lashing against the glass. She wanted nothing from them. She had only attended because Gallagher had legally mandated her presence under threat of a subpoena, citing a specific codicil in Thomas's will. She just wanted to go home to her tiny, drafty apartment and try to forget the people who had treated her husband like a disappointment. Gallagher shifted uncomfortably, pulling a thin, pathetic-looking manila folder from beneath the mountainous stack of legal binders. He looked at Chelsea, and for a fleeting second, something akin to pity flickered in his cold eyes. "And finally," Gallagher said, his voice dropping an octave, "to my daughter-in-law, Chelsea Martin." The room went dead silent. Brianna's head snapped toward the lawyer, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows narrowing into dangerous slits. "Excuse me," Brianna snapped. "Why is she receiving anything? Arthur is gone. Her ties to this family were severed the day he died." "Mr. Martin was quite explicit, Mrs. Martin," Gallagher replied smoothly. He opened the thin folder. "I shall read his exact words. To my daughter-in-law, Chelsea, who understood the value of quiet places and the true measure of a man's worth, I leave the entirety of property, parcel 88B. Regis barked out a laugh. "Property parcel 88B? What on earth is that? Some strip mall in Ohio?" Gallagher sighed. "It is a residential parcel located in Oakhaven, a remote unincorporated township in the Appalachian foothills of West Virginia. It comprises 1 acre of land and a single structure." The lawyer paused, looking down at his notes. "For the purposes of the estate transfer and tax assessment, we had the property evaluated last week." "And?" Brianna demanded, tapping her diamond-ringed fingers impatiently on the mahogany wood. "What is it worth? I won't have her walking away with family capital." Gallagher looked directly at Chelsea. "The structure on the property was legally condemned by the county 7 years ago due to severe foundational decay and roof collapse. The land itself is deemed inaccessible for commercial development due to its topography. All back taxes were settled by Thomas prior to his passing. Therefore, the official assessed market value for the estate transfer of the cabin and the land is $3. For a moment, the room was suspended in absolute silence. Then Regis lost his composure entirely. He threw his head back and roared with laughter. The sound was ugly, cruel, and echoed off the glass walls of the boardroom. Brianna joined him, her laughter a sharp, aristocratic titter that cut through the air like a serrated blade. $3, Regis gasped, wiping a tear of pure amusement from his eye. "The old man left you a rotting shack in the woods worth $3. God, I always knew he had a wicked sense of humor, but this is a masterpiece." Brianna smiled, a thin, venomous expression. "Well, Chelsea, dear, it seems you finally got what you deserve. A worthless pile of garbage, perfectly suited to your station in life. Perhaps you can sell it and buy yourself a cup of coffee. Or better yet, a new coat. That one looks like it was dragged behind a bus." Chelsea felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a flush of deep, humiliating embarrassment. She could feel the tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give them the satisfaction of her sorrow. She thought of Arthur, of his kind smile, and how much he had despised this room and everything it represented. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and calm. She reached across the massive mahogany table and plucked the thin manila folder from Gallagher's hands. "Thank you, Mr. Gallagher," Chelsea said, her voice remarkably steady despite the storm raging inside her. She didn't look at Brianna or Regis. She simply turned on her heel and walked toward the heavy oak doors. "Enjoy the wilderness, Chelsea," Regis called out to her back, his voice dripping with condescension. "Watch out for the bears." The heavy door clicked shut behind her, cutting off the sound of their renewed laughter. Chelsea leaned against the cold marble wall of the hallway, clutching the folder to her chest. A $3 cabin. It was an insult a final cruel joke orchestrated by a family that despised her. But as she looked down at the coordinates typed on the deed, she remembered Thomas's warm eyes during their secret lunches. He was a ruthless man, but he was never cruel without a reason. Why, she wondered, stepping into the elevator. Why did you leave me this, Thomas? 2 weeks had passed since the will reading, and Chelsea's life was rapidly unraveling. Her freelance graphic design work had dried up. Her landlord had raised the rent on her cramped apartment, and the meager savings she and Arthur had managed to put together were nearly depleted. As she sat at her tiny kitchen table, staring at a stack of past-due utility bills, her eyes kept drifting back to the manila folder sitting on the counter. Property. Parcel 88B. She had looked up Oak Haven, West Virginia, on the internet. It wasn't even a town. It was a blip on the map, a dense expanse of forested mountains, largely abandoned by the coal industry decades ago. The logical choice was to throw the deed in the trash. It would cost more in gas to drive there than the property was worth. But the lingering memory of Thomas Martin gnawed at her. Thomas didn't do anything by accident. If he wanted to insult her, he would have left her nothing at all. To go through the legal trouble of bequeathing a condemned $3 cabin required effort. With nothing left to lose, and an eviction notice looming in 30 days, Chelsea packed her beaten-up Honda Civic with a sleeping bag, a cooler of cheap groceries, a flashlight, and a set of basic tools. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she needed to see the final resting place of Arthur's father's legacy for herself. The drive was grueling. 8 hours of highway gave way to winding, treacherous mountain roads that seemed to narrow with every mile. By the time her GPS finally lost its signal, she was navigating by a printed topographic map Gallagher's office had reluctantly provided. The paved road turned to gravel, then to packed dirt, and finally into a deeply rutted, overgrown trail that threatened to tear the undercarriage out of her sedan. She parked the car at the edge of a dense tree line, where a rusted, chain-link gate hung limply off a single hinge. A faded, bullet-riddled sign read, "Private Property." Chelsea zipped up her jacket against the biting mountain chill and squeezed past the gate, following a weed-choked path. The forest here was old and imposing, the canopy so thick it blocked out the afternoon sun, casting the woods in an eerie twilight. After a 10-minute hike, the trees parted, and she saw it. Regis hadn't been exaggerating when he called it a rotting shack. The cabin was a tragedy of neglected architecture. Built of heavy pine logs, the structure leaned precariously to the left, groaning in the wind. The roof on the eastern side had completely caved in, crushed by the weight of a fallen oak branch years ago. Moss and creeping ivy had reclaimed the exterior walls, making the cabin look like a natural outcropping of the forest floor. The front porch was a death trap of splintered, rotting wood. Chelsea stood in the clearing, her heart sinking. What had she expected? A hidden mansion? A secret vault filled with gold bullion? It was just a ruined, dead thing, much like her relationship with the Martin family. Carefully testing every step, she navigated the porch and pushed open the front door. It shrieked on rusted hinges, revealing an interior that smelled heavily of mildew, wet earth, and animal droppings. The inside was a single, large room. Water damage had destroyed whatever furniture had once been there. A rusted iron stove sat in the center of the room, surrounded by piles of decaying debris. Chelsea spent the next few hours simply clearing out the garbage, dragging rotting wood and soggy insulation out into the yard. It was exhausting, back-breaking work. But the physical labor was a welcome distraction from the crushing anxiety of her impending bankruptcy. As she cleared a corner of the room that had miraculously survived the roof collapse, she found a small, waterlogged wooden nightstand. Inside the single drawer was a rusted tin box. Chelsea pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside, protected by a layer of waxed paper, was a small, leather-bound journal and a stack of Polaroid photographs. She took them over to the window to catch the fading daylight. The photos were from 30 years ago. They showed a much younger Thomas Martin, not in his usual bespoke Armani suits, but in faded jeans and a flannel shirt, smiling broadly. Next to him was a young boy, maybe 10 years old, holding up a freshly caught trout. It was Arthur. Tears finally spilled over Chelsea's eyelashes, tracking through the dirt on her cheeks. This wasn't a joke. This cabin was Thomas and Arthur's secret sanctuary, a place where they escaped the suffocating toxicity of Brianna and the relentless pressure of the corporate world. Thomas had left her his most precious, private memory. "Thank you," Chelsea whispered to the empty room, clutching the photos to her chest. The sentimental value was immeasurable, even if the financial value was literally $3. She decided to stay the night, laying out her sleeping bag in the dry corner near the iron stove. As darkness fell, the wind began to howl through the trees, signaling the arrival of a fierce Appalachian thunderstorm. Within an hour, rain was lashing against the remaining windows, and thunder shook the very foundations of the mountain. The noise was deafening. Chelsea huddled in her sleeping bag, shining her flashlight around the room, as water began to pour through the compromised sections of the roof. Suddenly, a massive crack of thunder echoed overhead, accompanied by a violent gust of wind that ripped a remaining section of the ceiling free. Rain dumped into the cabin in a torrential sheet. Chelsea scrambled backward, trying to drag her sleeping bag out of the new waterfall. As she threw her weight backward, her boot came down hard on a section of floorboards near the center of the room. The wood, thoroughly rotted by years of dampness and newly saturated by the storm, gave way with a sickening crunch. Chelsea shrieked as her leg plunged through the floor, jagged splinters tearing through her jeans and scraping her calf. She threw her arms out, catching herself on the solid joists before she could fall entirely through into the crawl space below. Panting heavily, her heart hammering against her ribs, she carefully hauled herself up, dragging her bleeding leg out of the hole. "Okay," she breathed, trying to calm her racing heart. "Okay, you're fine. It's just a broken floor." She grabbed her heavy-duty Maglite flashlight and crawled to the edge of the jagged hole to see how far the drop was. She aimed the beam down into the darkness. She expected to see dirt, rocks, and maybe the glowing eyes of a startled raccoon. Instead, the bright beam of the flashlight reflected off something cold, metallic, and distinctly unnatural. Chelsea wiped the rain from her eyes and leaned closer, ignoring the throbbing pain in her leg. About 3 feet below the ruined floorboards, resting on a slab of perfectly poured, pristine concrete, was a heavy, industrial-grade steel hatch. It looked like the entrance to a submarine or a bank vault, completely incongruous with the decaying pioneer aesthetic of the cabin above it. Wiping away decades of dust and debris from the top of the hatch, Chelsea found a digital keypad. It was dark, the battery clearly dead for years, but right beneath it was a manual override, a strange, cruciform keyhole. Chelsea froze. Her hand instinctively flew to the silver chain around her neck. 2 days after Arthur's funeral, Thomas had come to her apartment. He had looked exhausted, aged a decade overnight. He had pressed a heavy, cross-shaped antique key into her palm, closing her fingers over it. "Don't tell Brianna you have this," Thomas had rasped, his voice rough with unshed tears. "Put it on a chain. Hide it. Keep it safe for a rainy day, Chelsea. I promise you, the rain will come." Chelsea pulled the chain over her head. Her hands were shaking violently as she lowered herself into the hole, her boots hitting the solid concrete platform. She inserted the key into the heavy steel lock. It slid in perfectly. With a deep breath, Chelsea turned the key. A heavy hydraulic clack echoed in the small space, a sound so loud and final it seemed to silence the thunder outside. She gripped the rotating wheel on the hatch and pulled. The heavy steel door swung upward effortlessly, revealing a set of illuminated metal stairs leading down into the earth. The air wafting up from the stairs wasn't damp or foul. It was cool, dry, and smelled faintly of ozone and old paper. Chelsea descended slowly, her flashlight cutting through the dimness until motion sensors detected her presence. Suddenly, a series of recessed LED lights flickered to life, illuminating a space that defied all logic. She was standing in a climate-controlled, concrete-reinforced bunker, roughly the size of a large master bedroom. The walls were lined with heavy steel shelving, but it wasn't filled with doomsday prepper supplies. It was a fully functional, hidden executive office. A massive oak desk sat in the center, flanked by filing cabinets. On the back wall, built directly into the concrete, was a massive, commercial-grade Mosler safe. Chelsea walked toward the desk, her footsteps echoing in the subterranean silence. On the leather blotter sat a sleek, titanium briefcase. Resting on top of the briefcase was a sealed envelope with a single word written on it, in Thomas's unmistakable, aggressive scrawl. Chelsea. She sank into the high-backed leather chair behind the desk, her hands trembling as she broke the wax seal on the envelope. She unfolded the thick, cream-colored paper and began to read. My dearest Chelsea, if you are reading this, it means the worst has come to pass. I am gone, and you have braved the wilderness to claim the insulting inheritance I left you. You must understand, the $3 valuation was not an insult to you. It was a carefully constructed trap for my wife and my eldest son. Brianna and Regis are vultures. They measure the world entirely in dollar signs and immediate gratification. I knew that when the will was read, they would laugh at this property. I knew they would dismiss it, ignore it, and practically beg you to take it off the estate ledgers to avoid the trivial property taxes. Their arrogance is their fatal flaw. This cabin was Arthur's favorite place on earth. But what lies beneath it is the true foundation of the Martin legacy. 30 years ago, I realized Martin Real Estate Holdings was growing too fast, built on aggressive leverage and ruthless tactics. I needed a contingency plan. I needed leverage of my own against my own board of directors, and eventually against my own greedy family. Open the briefcase. The combination is Arthur's birthday. Chelsea stopped reading, her breath catching in her throat. She pulled the titanium briefcase toward her and spun the dials. 0814. The latches popped open with a sharp hiss. Chelsea lifted the lid. Inside, neatly stacked in custom-fitted foam, were rows of bearer bonds. Chelsea had worked in corporate design long enough to recognize them. They were untraceable, completely liquid instruments of wealth. She picked one up. It was denominated at $1 million. There were 50 of them in the case, $50 million in untethered cash. But it was the thick, legal binder resting beneath the bonds that drew her attention. She pulled it out and turned back to the letter. The bonds are for you, Chelsea. A belated apology for the cruelty you suffered from my family. But the binder is something far more dangerous. It is a weapon. You see, 30 years ago, I secretly purchased the prime commercial acreage in downtown Chicago, the exact land upon which the 3 flagship Martin skyscrapers currently sit. I bought the land under a ghost corporation called $3 Holdings, LLC. I then leased that land to Martin Real Estate Holdings on a 99-year ground lease. But here is the trick, my clever girl. The ownership of $3 Holdings, LLC, is legally bound, in perpetuity, to the physical deed of property parcel 88B in Oak Haven, West Virginia. Whoever holds the deed to this rotting $3 cabin is the sole owner of the LLC. Furthermore, I quietly suspended the collection of the ground rent 10 years ago. According to the ironclad lease agreement enclosed in that binder, if the rent falls into arrears for a decade, the landowner has the immediate, irrevocable right to terminate the lease, seize all structures built upon the land, and evict the tenants. Regis and Brianna think they inherited an empire. They didn't. They inherited buildings. You, Chelsea, own the ground beneath their feet. Do what you will with this power. Avenge my son. Avenge yourself. With all my love, Thomas. Chelsea sat in the silence of the bunker for a long time. The magnitude of what she was holding settled over her like a heavy, suffocating blanket, which slowly transformed into a mantle of absolute, undeniable power. She looked at the rotting wood ceiling above her, and then at the binder in her hands. Regis had laughed at her. Brianna had told her to buy a cup of coffee. Chelsea closed the briefcase. The tears were gone, replaced by a so-called diamond-hard resolve. It was time to go back to Chicago. Brianna held court near the ice sculpture, dripping in diamonds, accepting condolences for her late husband that were as fake as her smile. Regis stood at the podium, basking in the flashbulbs of the financial press, preparing to give his keynote address. "Ladies and gentlemen," Regis boomed into the microphone, his voice echoing across the cavernous room. "Today marks a new era for Martin Real Estate. We are not just building skyscrapers, we are building the future of this great city. And as the sole owners of our magnificent skyline properties, our foundation has never been stronger." "Actually, Regis, your foundation is a bit rotten," a voice rang out, crisp and amplified. The crowd parted. Standing at the back of the ballroom, holding a wireless microphone she had commandeered from the sound desk, was Chelsea. She was unrecognizable from the grieving, beaten-down widow in the frayed coat. Chelsea wore a razor-sharp, bespoke charcoal suit. Her posture was flawless, her gaze lethal. Flanking her were three men in dark suits, senior partners from one of the most ruthless litigation firms in the country, hired with Thomas's bearer bonds. Regis narrowed his eyes, shielding them against the stage lights. "Chelsea, what on earth are you doing here? Security, please remove this woman. She's trespassing." "I'm afraid I'm not, Regis," Chelsea said calmly, walking down the center aisle as the elite crowd murmured in confusion. "As a matter of fact, you are." Brianna pushed her way through the crowd, her face flushed with fury. "How dare you show your face here, you pathetic little gold digger? Did the $3 run out already?" Chelsea smiled. It was a terrifying smile. She reached into her leather attaché case and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, handing them to her lead attorney, Harrison Cole. Harrison stepped forward, unfolding a formal, court-stamped document. "Mr. Martin, Mrs. Martin, you are hereby served." He pressed the papers directly into Regis's chest. Regis instinctively grabbed them, looking down in bewilderment. "Served? Served for what?" "Eviction," Chelsea said, her voice carrying easily through the silent ballroom. Regis burst into laughter, looking around at his shareholders. "Eviction? From my own buildings? Have you lost your mind, Chelsea?" "They aren't your buildings, Regis," Chelsea replied, stepping up to the edge of the stage. Well, technically the steel and glass are yours, but the dirt they sit on, that belongs to $3 Holdings LLC, a company whose sole asset is the deed to a cabin in West Virginia, the same cabin you laughed at while you handed it to me. Regis's laughter died in his throat. He looked at his own corporate lawyers, who were scrambling toward the stage, their faces pale as they read over Regis's shoulder. "Mr. Martin," one of the corporate lawyers whispered, his voice trembling so badly the microphone picked it up. "Sir, this is a valid ground lease, signed by your father 30 years ago. We don't own the land under the plaza, the tower, or the spire," Brianna gasped, clutching her pearls. "That's impossible. Thomas left us everything." "He left you the company," Chelsea corrected her gently. "He left me the leverage." Chelsea turned to address the crowd of stunned shareholders and journalists. "For the past 10 years, Martin Real Estate Holdings has failed to pay rent to the landowner. Under the terms of the lease, the landowner has the right to immediately terminate the contract, seize the assets on the land in lieu of back rent, and evict the current tenants. And as of this morning, a federal judge granted the injunction." Pandemonium erupted in the ballroom. Journalists began shouting questions. Shareholders pulled out their phones, frantically calling their brokers as the reality of the situation set in. Martin Real Estate was built on land they didn't own, and they were about to be evicted from their own empire. Regis looked like he was going to be sick. He gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles white. Chelsea, wait. We can work this out. We can buy the land from you. Name your price. 10 million? 50 million? Chelsea looked at the man who had tormented her husband, who had mocked her grief, and who had valued her at $3. "My price?" Chelsea asked softly, leaning into the microphone. "My price is your resignation, Regis, yours and Brianna's. You will surrender all voting shares to a philanthropic trust, step down from the board, and walk away with nothing but the clothes on your backs. If you refuse, I will execute the eviction, seize the skyscrapers, and bankrupt you both by morning." "You can't do this!" Brianna shrieked, lunging forward, only to be restrained by Harrison Cole. "We are the Martin family. You are nothing." "I am Chelsea Martin," she replied, her voice ringing with finality. "And I think you'll find that I am quite wealthy." She turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving the shattered ruins of Brianna and Regis's empire behind her. Chelsea didn't need the skyscrapers. She had $50 million, her husband's memory, and a quiet, 1-acre parcel in West Virginia, where she was finally going to fix the roof. If you were captivated by Chelsea's incredible journey from a mocked widow to a woman holding the ultimate key to a family's legacy, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with your friends who love a good story of karma and hidden treasures. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our thrilling real-life dramas. What would you have done? Let us know in the comments below.